The lake, the fire pit, and the flashing lights. The say piece is priceless. I paid for mine twice. First, with every dollar I had saved over a decade of grueling shifts and contract work, and again, with my patience, when I crossed paths with a homeowners association I hadn't even signed up for. I bought the ranch for freedom, not friction. Nestled against the hills of northern Arizona, my 26-acre spread had an old weathered barn, a sturdy 2-story house with solar panels lining the roof, like armor, and a secret tucked far out back, a spring-fed lake that curved like a teardrop beneath a ring of ponderosa pines. It had no name, just the silence of wine-tossed water, a wooden dock some homesteader had hammered in generations ago, and a view that calmed even the worst days. That lake was mine. Or so I thought. I'd taken to camping out there a few weekends every month, even though the house was just a 15-minute ATV ride away. There was something poetic about pitching a tent, setting a fire, and letting the soft sounds of crickets and frogs lull me to sleep. On one such evening, just as the last of the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline, I was cooking a trout I'd pulled from the water, butter sizzling on the cast iron, camp chair dug into the dirt, dog curled at my feet. It was the picture of simplicity. That was when I saw headlights bobbing through the trees. At first, I assumed it was one of my buddies. A few knew the route and sometimes dropped by unannounced. But as the vehicle drew closer, its beams harsh and erratic, I caught the outline of something unfamiliar, a golf cart with a plastic HOA logo slapped on the front like some badge of authority. Out stepped a woman in her 60s, hair shellacked into an immovable helmet, clipboard under one arm, fury etched into every wrinkle of her face. Behind her, a man with mirrored sunglasses and a radio squawking at his belt tried to look official, but only succeeded in looking lost. "Sir, this is not an authorized camping area," she snapped before I could offer so much as a greeting. "You're in violation of Community Ordinances 3.12 and 7.8. I laughed, genuinely confused. "Ma'am, this is my land. I bought it outright 3 years ago. The lake is inside my property line." She pointed sharply toward the water like it had personally offended her. "This lake falls under our protected shared use designation. Your little fire, and that," she sneered at the fish, "is illegal under HOA guidelines. You need to vacate immediately or will be forced to escalate." I stood up slowly, not in aggression, but to meet her eye level. I had dealt with difficult people before, but never one who stormed into the wilderness like she was patrolling a mall parking lot. "With respect, I think you're confused. This area was surveyed and fenced years before your development even started. That lake isn't shared, it's mine." She didn't even blink. She just turned to the man with the radio. "Call it in. He's trespassing and potentially armed." My heart skipped, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity. They had walked across my land, confronted me at my own campsite, and now they were calling the cops on me. Still, I didn't move. I let them speak. I let the crackle of the fire and the chirping of the insects fill the silence. While they muttered coordinates and spun lies over the line, my dog growled low under his breath. He knew tension when he smelled it. The sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later. By then, the HOA duo had stood at the edge of my firelight like sentinels, as if my roasting marshmallows somehow posed a risk to civilization. The deputy, a younger guy named Reyes, I vaguely remembered seeing at the gas station, approached, with caution, hand near his holster, eyes flicking between me and the Karen-esque woman already mid-rant. "He's got fire without a permit. He's fishing without community permission, and he threatened to get violent when we confronted him." I shook my head, keeping my voice calm. "That's all false. I live here. This is my lake, and they walked across my land to get here." Reyes looked at me, then at them. "You got paperwork to prove that?" I nodded and pulled out a weathered map from my backpack, the original survey deed from when I bought the property. I kept it laminated for situations just like this. He took it and walked off with a flashlight to examine the markings. Meanwhile, the woman kept spouting about regulations, neighborhood charters, fines, and respecting community cohesion, whatever that meant. I kept my mouth shut. Years in construction had taught me something valuable. Let the evidence do the talking. After 15 tense minutes, Reyes returned. "According to this, he said, tapping the map. This lake and the surrounding 20 yards are within his property line. Which means, ma'am, you're the ones trespassing. You'd think someone had slapped her. Her face turned pale, then red, then a blotchy mix of the two. That can't be right. Our records show. Reyes cut her off. Your records don't override a legal deed. If you have a dispute, take it to civil court. But as far as tonight goes, you're on his land. I suggest you leave before you get cited. The man with the radio quietly started backing toward the cart. She sputtered for a few seconds before storming after him, muttering something about lawyers and board meetings. I watched their little vehicle disappear into the trees, the electric hum of their retreat barely louder than the crickets. Reyes gave me back my map. Sorry about that. We've been getting calls from that HOA for months. They think they own half the county. I offered him a s'more. He declined with a grin, but thanked me before heading off. I sat back down by the fire, the weight of the encounter finally settling. They had tried to own me through intimidation, tried to twist reality to fit their delusion of control, but it hadn't worked. Not tonight. Still, something gnawed at me. If they were so confident about the lake being shared use, where had they gotten that idea? I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let this go. Tomorrow, I would dig into every plat map, every HOA document, every survey within 10 miles. Something wasn't adding up. I had a feeling this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deeper rooted in something I hadn't seen yet. And whatever it was, I was going to uncover it. Because if this was just the beginning, I needed to be ready for war. The map, the meeting, and the line in the dearth morning after the confrontation at my lake. I woke up with the kind of fire in my gut that doesn't come from a camp breakfast. It was the kind of fire that only burns when your peace is disturbed, when something you hold sacred like land, like freedom is challenged by those who think clipboards and bylaws give them dominion over everything they see. I packed up my gear, stoked out the fire until the coals hissed with steam, and made the short ATV trip back to the main house. As the outline of my ranch home came into view, the barn to the right, the old oak to the left, I couldn't shake the mental image of that woman standing on my land as if it belonged to her. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was entitlement, pure and simple. By midday, I had spread out every document I owned on the dining room table, the original deed, the topographic surveys, the boundary plat, even aerial photos from the county. His system. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the lake, the pines, the whole east section of my land, right down to the cedar fence that ran from the rocky ridge to the southern tree line, was privately owned. I didn't just want to be right, I needed to understand where this delusion of shared use had come from. And what I found changed everything. The HOA that now bordered the southern edge of my land was called Whispering Pines Estates, a name that sounded charming enough until you read their governing documents. I downloaded the covenants and restrictions from their community portal and scanned every page. What stood out immediately was a vague reference to common area lake to be a water feature listed on several maps as being for the use of HOA members for kayaking, fishing, and community relaxation. I opened the document's embedded map and my jaw tightened. They had labeled my lake as their common area lake to be. No lines, no surveyor's notation, just a blob of blue drawn over my land as if a kid with a crayon had claimed it during recess. I called the county recorder's office to verify where the development's boundary ended. The clerk on the line, a kind older woman named Markey, confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA development did not legally extend beyond their eastern trail loop. Their eastern nature path, as they called it in their brochures, stopped nearly 150 yards away from my lake. When I asked her how this might have been misrepresented, she sighed and said something that made my stomach turn. Well, technically, when they filed the application, they marked your lake as a visual amenity on their environmental proposal, but that doesn't mean they own it. Some developers do that to make the project more attractive to buyers. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the wall for a solid minute. A visual amenity. That was the seed. A developer had tried to boost property values by showcasing a feature they had no right to claim, but somewhere along the line, It had transformed from a sales pitch into a false belief, a belief that gave rise to rules, enforcement, and whole foot patrols acting like landlords on my soil. It was time to act. The next morning, I walked down to the property line with 6 metal signs I had made at a local print shop. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I drove each post deep into the dirt every 50 feet along the lake's border, and then I added 3 game cameras hidden in the trees. I wanted eyes on every angle, especially the winding trail that snuck up through the HOA land. If they thought they could waltz through here again, they were going to be on camera. And this time, it wouldn't be just words against words, it would be proof. And proof came quicker than I expected. 2 days later, just after sunrise, my motion sensor alert pinged on my phone. I pulled up the feed and watched as 2 men in polos, both wearing laminated name tags, walked right past the no trespassing sign, carrying clipboards. One of them pointed toward the water, and the other scribbled something down. A minute later, a third person, an elderly man with a fishing rod, ambled past them and sat on the old dock. Like he had done it 100 times. He probably had. I printed out the stills, stapled them to a manila folder along with copies of my deed and county maps, and headed straight for the Whispering Pines HOA board meeting, which happened to be scheduled for that same evening. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need an invitation, I needed an audience. Their clubhouse, a fox lodge with artificial stone and golf cart parking, was buzzing with idle chatter when I walked in. The room went quiet when they saw me. Apparently, the man who had dared to roast marshmallows on their lake was now considered the town outlaw. I made my way to the front table, where 5 board members sat behind nameplates and microphones like some miniature senate. Karen, that's what I now called her, since she hadn't bothered to introduce herself, sat dead center with a smug, condescending look. "This meeting is for HOA members only," she said flatly. "Then you better ask your members to stop entering my land," I replied, placing the folder in front of her. She snorted, but as she flipped through the documents, her expression shifted. Her eyes darted over the county maps, the camera stills, and finally the deed. She looked up, suddenly less confident. "I suggest your HOA hold an emergency meeting," I said calmly, "because what you're doing isn't just aggressive, it's illegal." The room buzzed again. Soft murmurs of, "Is that true?" and "Wait, I thought the lake was ours," whispered across the chairs. Karen straightened and slammed the folder shut. "We'll have our legal team review this," she muttered. "You do that," I said, turning to walk out. "But if I see another trespasser, I won't be showing up here next time, I'll be showing up in court." By the time I got home that night, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The HOA wasn't going to back down. Not when they had built their narrative and possibly their home prices around a lake they didn't own. But now they had been exposed, and exposure makes the powerful nervous. The next week would be hell. I knew that. Karen and her clipboard crew weren't going to fold overnight. But I had something they didn't: the truth, the law, and the will to fight, and I was just getting started. Fences, fines, and the secret lease agreement. The air shifted in the days that followed the HOA board meeting. It wasn't the wind or the weather, but something heavier, a quiet, calculated hostility that seemed to hum beneath the surface of every interaction with the bordering neighborhood. Where once I could hear the occasional laughter of kids echoing from the Whispering Pines trail loop, there was now only silence. No one crossed the path into the trees anymore, at least not in broad daylight. But that didn't mean the HOA was backing off. In fact, the silence felt more like a regrouping, like a predator crouched just out of sight. I didn't wait for their next move. I made mine. The very next morning, I drove into town and picked up several rolls of galvanized livestock fencing, along with a post driver and a few heavy-duty lockable gates. If they wanted lines drawn, I'd give them lines they couldn't miss. I'd kept that part of the land unfenced out of trust, out of decency. But clearly, that goodwill had been mistaken for weakness. I hired 2 of my ranch hands, and together, we worked for 3 days straight, digging post holes, stretching wire, securing borders. I didn't just fence the lake, I reinforced the entire perimeter of my eastern property line, with fresh private property signs staked every 30 feet. and trail cameras mounted high in the trees. The message was clear. The lake was off limits, and I wasn't bluffing. But while I was busy erecting defenses, the HOA was busy digging into its bag of dirty tricks. The first fine came in the mail on a Friday afternoon, sealed in a bright white envelope stamped with the Whispering Pines logo. It wasn't addressed like a standard HOA letter. Instead, it carried the same formal formatting as a legal warning. The letter claimed I owed the association $250 for unauthorized obstruction of shared access paths and natural use zones. They had attached grainy, zoomed-in photos of my new fence posts from what appeared to be taken from the trail outside their neighborhood, likely taken with a phone. Along with the fine was a threat: failure to remove the fencing and restore the shared green space would result in escalating legal actions. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. It was a flimsy attempt to rewrite reality, a desperate move that ignored both geography and legality. But what unnerved me wasn't the threat itself, it was that they believed in it. They were acting not like trespassers who'd been caught, but like landlords evicting a squatter. That kind of blind arrogance didn't just sprout out of nowhere, it was fed by something. So I began digging deeper. I paid a visit to the county zoning office and pulled every document I could find related to Whispering Pines development history. It was tedious, the kind of work that required patience and a strong cup of black coffee, but it paid off. In a thick folder of planning and zoning applications from years earlier, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a lease use agreement, a small print document buried inside the environmental impact report, quietly filed alongside other application materials. According to the form, the developer of Whispering Pines had submitted a proposal to temporarily lease a section of land adjacent to the property line for beautification purposes. From a now-defunct ranching trust, the document was 10 years old and expired 2 years before I had even purchased the land. It was never renewed, but it included a map, an outdated, unofficial one showing my lake marked as a community enhancement zone. There it was. The lie had a paper trail, not an ownership claim, not a transfer of rights, just a temporary lease for scenic value. But instead of updating the HOA guidelines or removing the lake from their map, the board had apparently chosen to let the fantasy continue. For years, they'd convinced the neighborhood that the lake belonged to them. They had even built benches near their trail to look out across it. They'd sold homes to new families, advertising access to private lakes and walking paths. It was fraud by omission, and now I had proof. But I wasn't done. I sent a certified letter to the HOA board, complete with photocopies of the expired lease, my property survey, and the county zoning confirmation that the parcel was outside their jurisdiction. I gave them 10 days to retract their fine, cease all trespassing, and issue a correction to the residents, or I would file suit for trespass, harassment, and defamation. What I didn't expect, however, was how the residents themselves would begin to turn. 3 days after I mailed the letter, a man in his late 50s showed up at my front gate. He wore a denim jacket, had a sun-wrinkled face, and carried a copy of the HOA newsletter rolled under his arm. He introduced himself as Ben, a homeowner from Whispering Pines, and said he'd been living there since the development was just starting. "Mind if I come in for a second?" he asked. "I think we've both been played." Over coffee, he explained what had been happening on his end. Apparently, there'd been quiet murmurs in the community for a while, people questioning why they were getting fined for walking near the lake, while others were told it was community space. Some older residents, like Ben, remembered when the HOA president had once promised open lake access forever during a town hall, while newer homeowners were shocked to learn there were even restrictions. It had all been kept vague, just enough to keep confusion high and accountability low. "I've always thought the lake looked too remote to belong to us," Ben said, staring into his mug. "But Karen and her group, they made us believe it was part of the lifestyle. Now I'm starting to think the HOA has been lying to all of us." I showed him the lease agreement, the boundary maps, and my surveillance photos. His eyes widened. He asked if he could have a copy to share with a few of his neighbors. I agreed, but I asked for something in return. "Do you know if the HOA has been collecting fees for lake maintenance?" I asked. He nodded, Yeah, it's on our annual bill, green space maintenance and lake upkeep, $380 a year per household. That hit me like a hammer. There were over 70 homes in Whispering Pines. That meant, for years, the HOA had been collecting nearly $26,000 annually for a lake they didn't even own. And that was just what was listed on paper. Who knew what else had been siphoned under the table? It was bigger than a trespassing issue now. It was theft, fraud, a scam built on top of my land. I knew then that I wasn't just going to defend my ranch. I was going to expose everything. I would tear down the curtain and show the neighborhood the machine behind it. Not out of revenge, but because justice deserved daylight, and because no one should have to fight this kind of battle alone. By the time Ben left, he wasn't just a neighbor, he was an ally. And that night, as I sat once again by the lake, watching the moonlight dance across the water, I realized something deeper. This wasn't just a conflict over fences or fines. It was a fight for truth in a world too used to silence, a stand for ownership, for honesty, and for something far more sacred than property lines. It was a stand for peace, but the war was far from over. Cameras, confrontations, and the cracks in the board the days after Ben's visit were like the stillness before a storm. The kind of silence that makes you question whether you imagine the whole thing or if something larger was lurking, waiting to strike. But I knew better. The HOA wasn't going to let this slide. They had built an entire illusion around a lake that didn't belong to them. And now that illusion was cracking from the inside. And like any cornered beast, they would thrash before they collapsed. I had the paperwork, the videos, the expired lease agreement. And now I had been a long-time resident willing to speak the truth. But what I didn't expect was that his quiet knock on my gate had sparked something bigger than I had imagined. It started with whispers. Ben passed around the copies. I gave him to a few trusted neighbors, people he knew weren't part of Karen's inner circle. Within a week, I began to see unfamiliar cars slowing near my gate, people pointing, taking pictures, or sometimes parking and walking the fence line. I checked my trail cameras every morning and found a steady stream of HOA residents, stopping to read the private property signs or taking photos of the fence line. And then the emails started. Some were cautious residents asking me for confirmation, questioning what they had been told for years. Others were angry, not at me, but at their own board, stunned to learn their HOA fees had been funding the upkeep of land they had no right to. One couple, both in their 40s, wrote to tell me they were selling their home, but were furious that the lake had been listed as a key amenity in their real estate documents. It was the lake that sold us on this place, they wrote. We moved in 3 years ago, thinking we had weekend access to a natural retreat. If this is true, the HOA misled us. We want to help however we can. By the time I finished reading that email, I realized the war was no longer between me and the HOA, it was between the truth and the lie. My job now wasn't just to protect my land. It was to tear down the illusion, brick by brick, in front of the people who had been manipulated. And the best way to do that wasn't with a lawsuit, it was with daylight. I started preparing a presentation using a combination of drone footage, survey maps, motion-detected camera footage, and records. From the zoning office, I created a visual timeline of the lie. It showed how the HOA had once leased the lake area for visual landscaping, how the lease expired before I ever purchased the land, and how they continued using it in marketing materials and fee structures. I cross-referenced the HOA's own budget reports publicly available through the county with resident testimonies and internal newsletters. I backed it all with documents bearing government stamps and notary seals. When it was done, I had a 22-slide presentation titled, "The Lake That Was Never Yours." But there was still the matter of how to present it. The HOA board certainly wasn't going to give me a platform in one of their meetings, so I chose to do it my way on neutral ground. One rented out a small community center space just outside the development, posted an open invitation on the Whispering Pines online forum, which, thankfully, Karen didn't control, and sent printed flyers to every mailbox in the development through certified mail. No dramatics, no accusations, just an invitation, concerned about HOA transparency. Come hear the other side. The night of the meeting arrived like the first clap of thunder before a storm. I parked my truck near the building, heart beating. faster than I cared to admit. I wasn't a public speaker. I was a builder, a rancher, a man who preferred campfires over microphones. But tonight wasn't about being polished. It was about being honest. To my surprise, over 40 people showed up. Some came with notebooks, others with tired expressions that said they'd been putting up with nonsense for years. I recognized Ben, sitting in the front row. Others I didn't know, but their eyes were sharp, questioning, curious. I took the stage with a projector and a remote in my hand, and I told them the story. I walked them through the fake lease, the expired agreement, the drone footage of the true boundary lines. I showed them side-by-side maps, my official survey versus the HOA's fictitious lake diagram. I explained the zoning distinctions, and then I hit them with the numbers. $380 a year from each of them, totaling over $25,000 annually collected under false pretenses for a lake. The HOA had no legal right to use or claim. A gasp rippled through the room, but it was the silence afterward that landed hardest, the quiet realization that they'd all been duped. That's when someone in the back stood up, a tall man, gray hair pulled into a ponytail, his voice firm. "Why haven't we heard this from the board?" he demanded. "Why were we told it was our lake? Why are we paying for land we don't own?" More murmurs followed. A woman near the front raised her hand and shared that her kids had been yelled at by a board member for playing near the lake gate. Another older man admitted he had been fined last year for taking his canoe down the wrong path. The room turned from curiosity to frustration to outright fury, and I stepped back, letting them speak. This wasn't about me anymore. The truth had found its voice. Later that night, as the last residents filtered out, Ben stayed behind to help me pack up the projector. He looked around the empty room, then gave me a look of quiet satisfaction. "You just broke the spell," he said. "Karen's not going to recover from this." He was right, but Karen wouldn't go down without swinging. The next morning, I received a cease and desist letter signed by the HOA's attorney, accusing me of defamation, interference with HOA operations, and unauthorized distribution of misleading materials. It was laughable, really, a scared last-ditch attempt to silence the truth. But I wasn't afraid. I scanned the letter, sent it to my attorney, and prepared for the next stage, a formal countersuit. But even before the legal wheels began turning, something shifted in the neighborhood. Karen's iron grip was loosening. I heard whispers that several homeowners had called for an emergency election to dissolve or restructure the board. Others had refused to pay the next installment of dues. And then came the biggest bombshell of all. Someone leaked the internal HOA email thread. It revealed that Karen and two other board members had known about the expired lease agreement for over a year. They had intentionally buried the truth to maintain control and revenue. The emails were damning, laced with contempt for ignorant residents and plans to shut down that rancher. Before he stirs up trouble, I didn't have to stir it. The truth did that on its own. That night, I stood by the lake again, alone, peaceful, proud. The fire crackled the same way it did the night the HOA first called the cops on me. But this time, I didn't feel surrounded. I felt seen. They had trespassed not just on my land, but on people's trust. But fences had been built, boundaries had been drawn, and soon justice would be delivered. The land was still mine, but now the truth was everyone's, and the battle for integrity was finally tipping in our favor. The lawsuit, the sheriff, and the fall of the board. Truth, once unleashed, doesn't return to silence. It ripples, it churns, it finds cracks in every wall built on lies. And by the time the internal HOA emails leaked, that ripple had become a wave, and the Whispering Pines board had no lifeboat in sight. I wasn't surprised when the cease and desist letter came, nor when the online neighborhood forum locked all posts. That was desperation. But what I didn't expect, not so soon anyway, was for my attorney to call and say, "We've got enough to move forward with a lawsuit, and you won't be the only plaintiff." Turns out, Ben wasn't the only resident who had grown tired of the HOA's twisted rulebook. After the public meeting I hosted, over a dozen families reached out to express their frustration. And within days, 4 of them officially joined me as co-plaintiffs in a civil suit against the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. The charges: trespassing, fraud, misappropriation of funds, harassment, and defamation. We weren't playing anymore. We had mapped the line, documented the violations, and found proof they knowingly lied. It was a legal powder keg, and we had just lit the fuse. I'll never forget the day the HOA president was served. It was a bright, quiet morning, the kind that makes you feel like the world is starting fresh. I was working by the barn, repairing one of the gates when my phone buzzed. A message from Ben, simple and direct, "It's done." I walked up the hill to my lookout spot, binoculars in hand, and sure enough there it was. A white sedan parked at the Whispering Pines clubhouse. A uniformed process server stepping out, crisp envelope in hand. Karen stood at the door, lips pursed so tightly they practically disappeared. Eyes darting as if looking for an escape, she tried to close the door. The server wedged his foot in place and calmly explained that this was an official court summons. She had no choice but to accept. For the first time, the Queen of Control had no power. The lawsuit filing hit the county clerk's site the next morning, and the media wasn't far behind. Local news picked it up under the headline, "Homeowner sues HOA over lake access fraud, residents join in." It was a story made for drama, small-town rebellion, corrupted leadership, and a peaceful rancher taking a stand against a power-hungry board. Within hours, I received interview requests from two stations and a regional property rights podcast. I declined most. I wasn't looking for fame. I was looking for justice still. The attention brought results. The sheriff himself showed up at my gate later that week, not to investigate me this time, but to talk. "Mind if I step inside?" he asked, tipping his hat. I nodded. Doors open. Sheriff Holloway was a practical man. I'd seen him around town plenty of times, straight shooter, never political. But now, standing in my living room, hands clasped behind his back, he looked tired. Not defeated, but burdened. "We've been getting reports from HOA members," he said. "Not complaints about you, complaints about them. Harassment, intimidation, falsified fines. Seems your little meeting woke up a lot of people." I handed him a copy of the expired lease and the financial records. Ben had helped uncover line items from the HOA budget clearly marked as lake maintenance fees dating back 5 years. Sheriff Holloway didn't flinch, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just civil. This could turn criminal. "I'm not asking for special treatment," I told him. "I just want the law to be applied equally." "You've got it," he said. "We're opening an inquiry into potential HOA financial misconduct. I'll keep you posted." That moment solidified something I'd been hoping for, but wasn't sure I'd find official backing. I was no longer alone. The legal system, the community, even the county sheriff, all were moving toward the same goal: truth, accountability, and the restoration of peace. Meanwhile, the internal collapse of the HOA board was accelerating. Within 2 weeks, the board members had resigned, citing health reasons and increased hostility from residents. Translation: they knew the walls were closing in. But Karen, she held on, desperate, determined. She doubled down on fear. She sent letters to residents warning that property values would crash if the HOA lost this battle. She claimed that outsiders were trying to destroy their way of life. And most absurdly, she accused me of staging a land grab conspiracy. But it wasn't working. People weren't scared anymore. They were furious. One Saturday afternoon, I received a call from a woman named Cynthia, a retired teacher and one of the longest-standing homeowners in Whispering Pines. She invited me to speak at a private gathering, a resident-led town hall, to discuss dissolving the HOA board and restructuring leadership. I hesitated at first. I didn't want to be seen as the new sheriff in town. But she assured me, "You won't be running anything. You'll just be helping us reclaim what's ours." So I showed up, and what I witnessed stunned me. Over 60 residents packed the local library conference room, speaking candidly about the damage the HOA had done to their community. Stories poured out: fines for garden gnomes, threats over paint colors, letters for weeds that weren't even on their property. But what united them was the lake. It had become a symbol not just of deception, but of what they had lost under Karen's rule: trust, freedom, and neighborly decency. I didn't deliver a speech. I didn't have to. I just told them the truth, that I had bought my land fair and square, that I didn't want conflict, and that I had every legal right to build fences, camp by my lake, and defend my peace. They clapped not for me, but for the clarity, the honesty, the break from fear. Then Cynthia stood and read a petition calling for an emergency vote to remove the current HOA board and replace it with a temporary resident council. Within 15 minutes, they had enough signatures to initiate the vote. The revolution had begun. By the following week, ballots were mailed. Within 10 days, the results were in. Karen and the remaining board were voted out. Unanimously. The sheriff launched his inquiry into misuse of funds. The civil suit gained traction, bolstered by public support and growing media attention. The new resident council announced it would fully audit whole records from the last 5 years. And, as for me, I was finally left in peace. I walked back to the lake one evening, just after the sun dipped below the hills, and stood on the same dock where Karen had once called the cops on me. The fireflies danced like silent victory chants, and the water was calm, reflecting the night sky like a mirror. I sat, let the wind speak, and closed my eyes. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about restoration of peace, of truth, of land and law, and when it means to stand for what's right. Even when every force tries to silence you. The war wasn't over, not completely. But the tide had turned, and the lake, my lake, was quiet again. The verdict, the victory, and the voice of the Lansom battles end in gunfire or flame. Others end in silence and echo of resilience after the chaos has faded. My battle with the Whispering Pines HOA ended with a wooden gavel striking a courtroom bench, a judge's steady voice reading from a sheet of legal findings, and the heavy, cathartic release of truth finally spoken aloud in front of witnesses and law. But the story doesn't end there, because while court rulings and legal wins make headlines, the real victories are often felt in the quiet when your land is respected, your name cleared, and the peace you once fought for returns stronger than before. It was a humid July morning when the civil court proceedings finally began. Our case had grown stronger than I'd imagined, thanks to the combined testimonies of over 20 Whispering Pines residents, financial statements uncovered by the newly elected resident council, and the investigation led by Sheriff Holloway's office. The courtroom wasn't packed, but the front row was filled with faces I'd come to recognize: Ben, Cynthia, couples who had once questioned me but now stood behind me. Even a few former board members, now divorced from Karen's rule, sat quietly on the plaintiff's side. Karen herself sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable behind a pair of oversized sunglasses. She wasn't the same smug enforcer I'd first met on the lakeshore. She looked smaller, diminished, like a figure that had grown too used to power and had no idea what to do without it. Our attorney, an old friend of mine named Carter, who used to be a rancher, before turning to law, opened the proceedings with facts. No theatrics, no drama, just hard truth. The expired lease, the fraudulent lake claims, the misappropriated funds, the trespassing incidents caught on camera, and the repeated harassment and intimidation by the board. Then came the testimonies. Ben was first. He spoke clearly, firmly, with the kind of quiet fire that only comes from being deceived by people you once trusted. He recalled the board meetings, the lies about lake access, and the fear residents felt when opposing Karen meant becoming a target. Then Cynthia, who brought receipts, emails, newsletters, community memos that directly contradicted the HOA's own documents. One by one, the stories piled up like stones in a dam built to hold back the HOA's tide of control. When it was my turn, I stood up without notes, looked the judge in the eye, and spoke from the place where the land and truth meet. I didn't pick this fight. I began. I bought a piece of land, a lake, and a dream of peace. I built a life where the wind through the trees and the ripple of the water was enough for me. And then one night, strangers walked onto my land, called me a criminal, and tried to turn my own property into something they could profit from. They lied, they trespassed, and when I stood up to them, they tried to bury me in bureaucracy. But what they didn't count on was the people around them waking up to the same truth. This case isn't about fences or fines. It's about what happens when authority stops serving the people and starts serving itself. I could feel the silence in the room tighten. The judge nodded slowly, then signaled the defense. Karen's lawyer tried. He fumbled with language, blamed the developers, claimed it was a clerical oversight, that the lease had been misinterpreted, but the damage was already done. The paper trail was too strong, the evidence too clear. Karen refused to testify. When asked if she'd like to speak, she declined. Her lips pressed into a line that said everything. She knew it was over. The judge took 2 days to deliver a verdict. During that wait, I didn't stress. I went back to the ranch, fixed up the old dock, mended a few sections of fence that had worn from the wind. The lake shimmered under the late summer sun, untouched, unbothered, unaware of the war that had been waged over its still waters. Then the call came. Carter's voice was steady. We won. The court ruled in our favor on all counts. The HOA was ordered to publicly retract all false claims of ownership or access to the lake, cease all use of the lake's image or name in marketing and internal documents, pay damages to the residents who were fraudulently charged lake maintenance fees, cover all legal costs for the plaintiffs, issue a formal apology, which the court would help draft. But the real blow came not from the fine or the judgment but from what followed. The county's investigation, backed by our suit, opened the door to deeper financial audits. Within weeks, it was revealed that Karen had personally signed off on over $18, zero in questionable reimbursements, so-called board expenses that included weekend retreats, catered board meetings, and even landscaping at her own home build. As community improvement, she wasn't just a liar, she was a thief. The resident council submitted all findings to the district attorney's office. 2 months later, Karen was arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The footage of her being escorted from her home in handcuffs was surreal. I watched it once, then turned it off, not out of pity, but because it was no longer my fight. Justice was already doing its job. In the aftermath, Whispering Pines changed. The fences I put up still stand, but they're no longer a wall, they're a reminder of what's mine and what should never be taken without truth. The new HOA Council works with transparency, with rotating volunteers instead of lifetime dictators. Ben was asked to join, but declined, choosing instead to start a community gardening initiative. Cynthia now leads monthly town halls, where residents actually get to vote, speak, and be heard. As for me, I kept to the same rhythm I always had. Mornings by the lake, long walks with my dog. Sometimes I still camp down there, just because I can. No threats, no visitors pretending to own what they don't. Just peace. A few weeks ago, I received a package from one of the younger couples who had joined our lawsuit. Inside was a small plaque, hand-carved, with my name and a quote etched. Below, when truth stands its ground, even mountains must bow. I hung it near the dock, nailed to an old pine that had stood longer than any HOA charter ever would. I didn't fight for that quote. I didn't need the recognition, but it meant something. It meant that in a world where power often crushes the quiet man, someone still noticed when the quiet man stood tall. This story may be over, but its echo lives on. In every neighborhood ruled by fear, in every homeowner who's been bullied by a board, in every person told they don't belong on the land they've bled to build, this story is for them. A reminder that power must always answer to truth, and that no matter how many signatures a board gathers, they'll never sign away what a man has earned through sweat, sacrifice, and grit. So the next time someone shows up on your land with a clipboard and a smirk, remember this: you don't need permission to stand your ground. You just need the courage to do it. And sometimes, that's more than enough. The land restored, but the battle never really ends. Justice may be delivered in a courtroom, but peace is something you reclaim with time. After the verdict was handed down, the dust began to settle over Whispering Pines and my ranch. Karen's arrest had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents who once feared the HOA board now spoke openly, freely, some even apologetically. I didn't hold grudges, not against the ones who were fooled, only against the ones who used deception as currency. But just as the embers of war were cooling, I learned something that reminded me peace must always be guarded. See, a few weeks after the court ruled in our favor, I received a call from an old friend of mine, Davis, a seasoned surveyor who'd helped map my original property lines when I bought the ranch years ago. He'd been following the lawsuit from the sidelines, and now he had a story of his own to share. "You're not going to like this," he said, "but you need to know Whispering Pines is planning to expand." I didn't understand at first. "Expand?" "Yeah," he continued. "The developer who originally built the neighborhood sold a chunk of undeveloped land, about 30 acres, to a private firm. That land backs right up to the far north corner of your ranch. It's not part of the old lease, but it borders your hunting trail and one of your freshwater springs. If they build through it, they'll be right up against your fence." That hit me hard. Not because I feared losing land my deeds were secure, but because I had already seen what happened when powerful people with false assumptions brushed too close to my world. I had just spent a year fighting for the sanctity of my lake, only to find that while one beast was slain, another had started to stir in the background. I drove out to the edge of my northern boundary that evening, flashlight in hand, boots sinking into the moss. The air smelled like damp pine and caution. There was a rough clearing on the other side of the tree-lined flags in the ground, pink ribbons tied to branches, and a few survey markers poking up like silent warnings. It wasn't much yet, but it would be. I knew the signs. This wasn't just exploration, it was preparation. The next day, I contacted the county planning office. I requested all development proposals connected to Whispering Pines and any new private acquisition nearby. Sure enough, the paperwork was there, dry, official, and dripping with red flags. The firm had applied for Phase 2 of a housing development under a different name, Meadow Ridge Crossing. But the signatures on the funding were familiar. One of them was Richard Talbot, a former board member from the HOA, who had resigned quietly after the scandal broke. So that's how they were playing it. The HOA might have been dismantled, but its remnants had simply changed clothes and names. And now they were back, quietly assembling a new plan, one that wouldn't just skirt the old boundaries, but challenge them again from another angle. Only this time, it wouldn't be about access to a lake. It would be about control of the space just beyond the next tree line. I wasn't angry, not at first, just disappointed. But disappointment quickly turned to resolve. This land had been in my hands for less than a decade, but I had fought for it harder than some people fight for their lives. I had walked it, bled on it, rebuilt it from the droughts and floods that came in cycles. The soil had seen fire, and the fences bore scars from more than time. I wasn't going to let another chapter begin with quiet encroachment. So I began preparing again, not for war, but for stewardship. The first thing I did was meet with a land use attorney, someone new, someone who specialized not just in defense, but in conservation. We began drafting a protective covenant that would legally designate certain parts of my ranch, specifically the northern corridor and the spring, as conservation easements. That meant they could never be developed, subdivided, or claimed for utility expansion. I was locking down my land with ironclad language. At the same time, I met with the new Whispering Pines resident council. I showed them the expansion proposal and warned them what it could mean, not just for me, but for them: more traffic, higher taxes, strain on water infrastructure, and worst of all, the return of bad actors hiding behind glossy developer brochures. To their credit, the council acted fast. They issued a neighborhood-wide alert, organized a vote to oppose any annexation attempts by the new developer, and even passed a motion to join me in opposing the application at the county hearing. This time, I wasn't standing alone. This time, I had a community that had learned the hard way. But resistance wasn't enough. I needed to make it clear that any expansion threatening the integrity of my ranch would be met, not just with pushback but with exposure. So I did what they never expected. I went public. I wrote a piece for the local paper, titled "The View from the Fence, a Rancher's Warning About Silent Takeovers." I laid out everything: the first battle with the HOA, the court win, the attempted expansion. I didn't name names, but I painted a picture too vivid to mistake. I called for transparency, for respect, for boundaries, literal and moral. The story caught fire. The online version was shared over 10,000 times. Local radio stations invited me for interviews. A group of environmentalists reached out and offered support for the conservation easement. And most surprisingly of all, a state senator's office sent a letter requesting more details for potential legislation, protecting private ranch lands from suburban overreach. That was when I realized something bigger. This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It had become a movement. Whispering Pines had once symbolized control HOA letters, hidden fees, intimidation tactics. But now it was becoming a story of redemption, of neighbors waking up, of private citizens drawing the line. And in that spirit, I organized something new, a community workday on my ranch. I invited everyone, not just from Whispering Pines, but from town, the next county, neighboring farms. We cleared trails, we rebuilt fence lines, we repaired the old dock. But more than that, we connected. Over campfire coffee and barbecued ribs, people told their stories of petty HOA letters, of lost land, of silence and regret, and they left with more than just splinters. They left with resolve. A man named George, an old veteran with missing teeth and a crooked back, shook my hand and said, "You're not just guarding a ranch, son. You're guarding the idea that land still means something." He was right, and though I never planned to be the face of anything, I realized that some stories pick you, not the other way around. Mine had started with a lake and a tent and a call to the cops. It had evolved into courtrooms, arrests, and public reckonings. And now it had grown into something much deeper. It had become about the soul of the land itself. Today, when I walk that northern trail, I don't just see trees and springs and hills. I see lines, not drawn by tape or ink, but by legacy. I see what it means to defend what's yours, not with fists, but with facts, not with anger, but with action. The developers haven't pulled their proposal yet. They may still try to push it through, but now they're facing more than one man on a ranch. They're facing a wall of people who've seen what happens when silence is broken and truth finds its voice. And that voice, it won't be silenced again.